I'm so delighted to introduce Michael tonight, not only because he is a local member of the tech community here in Portland, but he's actually a hyper-local member of this community, and that he's also on the PDX coordinating committee. So we actually have one of our own here tonight, so that's pretty exciting. I haven't known Michael for that long, probably about as long as I've been on the coordinating committee, but in that time I've just been really touched by his clarity and his thoughtfulness and his general just very welcoming demeanor. So I'm really excited for the talk tonight. Michael's been involved in the tech community for over 20 years. He told me tonight that he read about Agile in 1999, and that's pretty much the start of it and the end of it, maybe, for the last 20 years. So he's been doing that for this long. And so tonight we're going to hear about his journey with that and some new thoughts that he's having about the future of Agile and what it means for all of us and who we are as people. So I hope I did a pretty good job encapsulating that. And so if I could have a really warm round of applause for my friend Michael.
Thank you. So is this working? Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. A couple of things before we start. I'd like to ask you to hold your questions until the end. I've got a lot of material tonight. I've been working on this for a while, and I'd like to get through it in an engaging and fast-paced way. I want to answer your questions, so I'm going to have a section at the end to deal with questions. I encourage you to write them down as you have them. So this is me, along with some contact information for me and a link to the blog that I've been writing that covers the topics that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I am here tonight to try to convince you of three things. The first is that we exist within a complex set of nested and intersecting complex systems. The second is that our brains evolved to help us navigate within those complex systems. And the third is that we can improve our agile practices by taking these two things into consideration. So that's the three things. Now, I'd like to begin with a little bit about how I got here. Some number of years ago, I found myself in the midst of a crisis. And as any good crisis should, this one slapped me up alongside the head and set a few things loose. Up until that point, I'd been an agile zealot of the XP clan. It may be a little hard to tell from this picture, but that guy right there, that's me. Right there, front and center, in the front row, very attentive, absorbing all I could. I first encountered XP in an article by Kent Beck. It was called Embrace Change with Extreme Programming. It was published in IEEE Computer Magazine in 1999. It changed my life. I immediately started breaking my work into stories. I organized the stories into short iterations. I became an addict to that little thrill that you get when the unit tests go green. I would even at times rerun the tests without making any changes at all, just to see it be green again. By 2002, I was boldly pinning my stories outside my cubicle wall for all to see, which made some of my coworkers very uncomfortable. This transparency thing felt to them a little like airing your dirty laundry. A number of them recommended to me that I take them off the cubicle walls and put them in a binder. Soon after, I had an opportunity to work on an online banking project with Jim Shore, which gave me an opportunity to see XP applied to a much larger team. I then had a stint as an engineer and manager in a rigorous XP startup where we pushed the boundary with things like promiscuous pairing. And so if you don't know what that is, I'd gladly talk about it with you later. But just know that it was one of the most profound engineering moments in my life. I just loved it so much. And so, as success will, this, of course, fed the zealotry, right? And along about 2006, I met my Waterloo. I'd taken an engineering management position in an education startup. The VP of engineering and I had had a number of conversations about Agile, my experiences with Agile, and how I might be able to bring that into the team and make things better. I was excited about it. I was confident. I was certain I could turn that ship around. Looking back, the signs of trouble were there from the beginning. Key among these was the fact that aside from my conversations with the VP of engineering, nobody in the organization had any interest in Agile. It didn't seem like there was any interest on the part of the team. There didn't seem like there was any interest on the part of the executive team. And part of it had to do with the nature of the work they were doing. The software organization was divided into two groups. There were those who were building the content for the courses, and there were those of us who were building the platform that delivered them. The content folks needed to deliver multiple academic years worth of lessons, meeting a complex set of requirements that were different for every state. This is before Common Core. And so every state had their own educational standards. It was a high-risk venture. There was no opportunity to be responsive to change. You had to understand the whole thing and get it right up front, or else you couldn't sell it in the yearly sales cycles. The platform didn't have those constraints, but this attitude, this mentality of big upfront design permeated the entire organization. I was just getting my head around this when the VP of engineering, the guy who had hired me, was let go. He was replaced by an old school engineering VP who was distinctly anti-agile. That was it. It was game over. And I should have known that. I should have known that. At the start of 2009, I found myself unemployed. It was the height of the Great Recession. I had 2 small children, and my wife had just started putting her toe back into the workforce as a project manager. It is embarrassing to share this with you now. It all seems like it's so obvious in hindsight. I should never have taken the position, or I should have adapted sooner, or moved on to an opportunity that was more in keeping with my interests. But I didn't. I persisted in beating that Agile drum, even though it was having zero impact. I had come into the company high on my Agile successes and allowed my zealotry to blind me to the truth. So, as my e-learning adventure slowly crumbled, my wife introduced me to a book she was reading by Lawrence Gonzalez. It's called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. Although my wife is not a software engineer, she had listened to me blather on about XP and Agile for enough hours that she immediately knew that this was about being agile in the wilderness. And it is. It demands that we be responsive to the context in which we find ourselves, and offers numerous examples of what happens when we don't. It describes adventurers who, like me, were blinded by their success, or pride, or ignorance, or foolhardiness, with consequences far dire than my own. Gonzalez analyzed hundreds of accident reports and case studies of survivors. He interviewed pilots and firefighters and Army Rangers, pulled together research from neuroscience and complexity science and psychology. From this, he pulled together a number of insights into who lives and who dies and why, insights that he called the Gonzalez rules of adventure. Now, when I first saw this, I went, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. The first one is perceive, believe, then act. The idea is perceive things as they are, not as you want them to be, not as you think they should be, not as you think you wish they were, but as they are, and act accordingly. Avoid impulsive behavior. Be quick, but don't hurry. Know your stuff. Be a consummate professional. Gather the information. Don't assume that you understand what's going on in a situation. Go out and talk to people. Gather as much information about what's going on, about the situation you're in, as possible. Commune with the dead. There are other people who have been down this path before. Take a look at what happened with them and try not to make the same mistakes. Be humble, because none of us knows everything. And when in doubt, be ready to bail out. It all seemed very sensible to me. If I look back on the times when I or my team have been in trouble, I can generally peg it to one of these things. I was perceiving the situation incorrectly, or not acting on what I perceived, or acting impulsively, or lacking technical depth in a certain area, or failing to gather the right information. As a framework for analyzing failure, it was spot on. But as I tried over the years to put this guidance into practice, to avoid failures, I found that it was not so easy. These high-level rules are not enough. I do better when I have mental models for how things work. I do better when I have scripts for day-to-day activities, for the rituals of developing software. I do better when I have gut-level triggers for when to act, when to stop acting, when to adjust what I'm doing. What I really needed was an agile theory of everything, something that would provide me with the model and lead me to the daily practices, and something that will work for me in all contexts. I mean, I was in this context that I just loved. I loved the fact that I was building software for K-8 education. I wanted to continue doing that, but I couldn't figure out how to be agile in that context. The problem is that this agile theory of everything, it doesn't exist. So over the years, I cobbled together my own. And I consider this a good enough model. The thing about models is they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be better than what you had. And so this, for me, is about giving myself something that's better than what I had before. And so what I'm doing here, and it's in some ways not that different from what Gonzalez did. I'm taking complex adaptive systems theory, which is a model for how things work. And I'm taking cognitive science, which gives us insights into how we perceive, make judgments, and make decisions. And I'm bringing those together to see if it can't inform our work practices. I'm calling it complexity-informed and human-based work practices. So here's an outline for the talk going forward. I'm going to start with a couple of field guides in keeping with the whole wilderness theme. One is an introduction to complex adaptive systems, and the other is an introduction to the cognitive science, the things that get applied in the work practices I'm developing. The second piece is going to be a discussion that applies those things to the adventures of Sir Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke, who were 19th century English explorers. And the final section is the field notes, which will talk about the work practices. Okay, so the first one, the Complex Adaptive Systems Field Guide. The first thing I want you to know is that complexity theory was there all along in Agile. You see that we've got two quotes here, one from Jeff Sutherland and the other from Jim Highsmith. Both of them were original signatories on the Agile Manifesto. Jeff Sutherland, of course, is co-creator of Scrum. Jim Highsmith has been a consultant and had his own Agile practice called Adaptive Software Development Methodology. And in both of these, they talk about complex adaptive systems. Jeff Sutherland is saying that he thought was at the root of both Scrum and Lean, and Jim Highsmith saying that it's found in several Agile methodologies. So here is the classic diagram of a complex adaptive system. The orange circles represent agents. For the moment, think of them as members of a team. The team members interact in complex formal and informal ways. There's the formal ways of developer finishes a chunk of work, passes it on to QA. QA finishes the quality assurance process, passes it on to acceptance testing. But there's also all the informal things like what happens around the water fountain. And it is all of these interactions, the thousands upon thousands of macro, micro, and nano interactions between team members emerges as the collective complex behavior of the team. The behavior that emerges that works well gets positive feedback and gets reinforced. The behavior that doesn't work well gets negative feedback and it dampens that behavior. But the core thing I want you to understand is that complex adaptive behavior in the team always emerges from within the team, no matter how much you try to micromanage it. And the reason is that you cannot micromanage all of the interactions. You know, the best that you can do typically is tell the team clearly what it is you're looking for and let the team figure it out. Let the team figure out how to deliver that. Now, the fact that complex adaptive behavior emerges from the team doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. And so that's why we have Agile coaches and Scrum masters that we embed in the team to try and help develop that behavior. But these are not the only complex adaptive systems in the world. This is a complex adaptive system. If you don't believe me, I recommend you pick up one of these. Molecular Biology of the Cell, 6th edition, all 1,400 pages of it, describing how cells work. This is a complex adaptive system. What emerges from this? Consciousness, exactly. This is a complex adaptive system, as is this. This is a team. In fact, pretty much anytime you get two of these together, you have a complex adaptive system. This is a complex adaptive system, Google. This is the stock market. It's here to represent the national economy. That is a complex adaptive system, as is that, and the solar system, and the galaxy, and the universe. One of the core things to get about CAS is that they are more than the sum of the parts. They are more than the sum of the nodes in the system. And that's because of the interactions. It is the interactions between them that is the most critical and important thing about the CAS. There's a gentleman, professor by the name of Scott Page, who uses this set of dials to indicate the core attributes of a complex system. With them all turned to 0, you get 0 complex behavior. With them all turned up to 10, you get chaos. And so the idea is that you have a dial for diversity, and that's the diversity kinds of nodes you have in the system. You have a dial for connectedness, that's how many connections between nodes. You have interdependence, which is how much they influence each other along those connections. And you have adaptation, which is how much the agents can change with changing circumstances. These are, of course, all interrelated. You can't get interdependence without connectedness, and diversity influences how much a system can adapt. So this is a great example of a CAS producing adaptation. Everybody knows about the Roseanne Barr Twitter storm, right? So at 2:45 a.m., she tweets about Valerie Jarrett, who is a black woman who was in the Obama administration, comparing her to an... At 10:33, she apologizes. At 12:04, the producer, Wanda Sykes, quits the show. At 1:21, co-star Sarah Gilbert condemns Barr's tweet. At 1:47, ABC cancels the show. And at 2:55, Barr's agent drops her as a client. The nodes of the Twitter network were numerous, they were diverse, they were connected by @ hashtags, and influencing each other to beat the band. And that's not the end of it. The network extended beyond Twitter. It included print, internet, and broadcast media. And there were no doubt lots of phone calls, texts, and emails that were being sent about around this. Within this set of intersecting groups, Twitter, the news outlets, and the production company, the interactions were rapid and numerous, and the adaptation was swift. Okay, a little bit about the cognitive science. So how many people have seen this video? Yeah. Okay, so how many people saw Dancing Gorilla? Yeah, I didn't. So here's how this works. At the start of the video, you're asked to count the number of times the students in the white shirts pass the basketball. Most of us follow the instructions carefully and come up with the right answer. And then the video asks if you saw the dancing gorilla. And many of us don't. We see what we're looking for. How many of you ride your bikes on the streets of Portland? Well, when you are out there riding, you need to keep in mind that you are the dancing gorilla. That the cars are not out there looking for you. And so you have to be looking out for them. So there's this idea about priming, which is the core idea is that how you respond to things depends on what is already in your brain. The classic instance is you'll have a set of words splashed on, and it might be that the word nurse is recognized more quickly following the word doctor than it is following the word bread. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon, but what I really am interested in is that there's a whole set of cognitive biases that are about what is already in your brain. And I think that is useful in doing our work, useful for us to understand. So here's some of them. There's the availability heuristic. Our brains are wired to assume that if we can easily recall something, then it's important, more important than the things that are harder to recall. There's the familiarity principle, which is we are drawn to those things we know, which may be the right thing or not the right thing, but we're drawn to it. There's the reiteration effect. The more we hear something, the more we believe it. The more we hear something, the more we believe it. There's the frequency illusion. When we learn or notice something new, all of a sudden we see it everywhere. But that doesn't mean it's all of a sudden happening more. And then there's the influence of strong emotions. When we're feeling strong emotions, we tend to think that the short-term goals arising from these emotions are in fact our long-term goals. But they're not. Okay, there's the primacy and recency effects. So if you read a list of words, when you try to recall those words, immediately after, you're going to remember the beginning words and the ending words more than the middle. Later recall, the ending words drop off, and it's the beginning words that will stay. So you should be careful about what you say at the start of a meeting, right? Because that's going to stick with people more. I told you at the beginning of this presentation what I wanted you to get from this, and I'm going to tell you again at the end. Okay, there's groupthink. This is a big one. This is a big, big, big one in terms of agile processes. Groupthink is a desire for harmony or conformity in the group. This can result in an irrational or dysfunctional decision, right? Group members try to minimize conflict and reach consensus without thinking critically about alternative viewpoints. In fact, the group will often actively suppress dissenting viewpoints and will actively ignore any external ideas. We have probably all encountered this. I see some nodding heads. It's a gut-level survival strategy, and that's the thing to understand. We do it because group cohesion has historically been more important than perfection in decision-making. Group cohesion has historically been more important. Back in the day, you only got to be part of one tribe, right? You only got to be part of one tribe, and you had to make that good. Okay, does anybody recognize what Dr. Seuss' book this is?
Bigger, better, butter battle?
This is the Sneetches. The Sneetches. So on the left are the plain-bellied Sneetches, and on the right are the star-bellied Sneetches. And to quote Dr. Seuss, those stars weren't so big, they were really so small. You might think such a thing wouldn't matter at all, but it does. You might notice that on the left, they're pretty sad, and on the right, they're kind of happy. We are built to differentiate between us and them. We're built that way. In fact, we are constantly worrying about whether we're in or we're out of the tribe. The trouble is, in the modern world, there are many possible tribes with amorphous boundaries. We've got team boundaries, department boundaries, company boundaries, city, state, country, racial, religious, place of origin, language, sexual preference, and gender. And now there's a lot more gender options too. In truth, we probably can't stop differentiating between us and them. And I'm not even sure it would be good if we could. We get an awful lot about being part of the tribe. But I do think that it's possible to redefine the boundaries, to figure out what constitutes our tribe. And here are some of the very good reasons we might want to. These are more cognitive biases. In-group favoritism, a pattern of favoring members of one's in-group rather than the out-group. And this, of course, is going to come up in hiring. It's going to come up in promotions. It's going to come up in performance reviews. There is the out-group homogeneity effect. We tend to believe that the folks outside our group are all the same, whereas we know that the group that we are part of, there's a lot of diversity. There's the cross-race effect, the tendency to more easily recognize faces of the race that you are most familiar with, which is typically brown. And this, of course, is going to have an impact on whether or not people feel like they're in or they're out, right? If you are looking at somebody who's a different race and you keep mistaking them for someone else of that race, then that's not going to make somebody feel terribly included. There is the not invented here, the NIH, which is a tendency to reinvent the wheel because, well, clearly we could do it better and cheaper and maintain it better. And there's the reactive devaluation, which is a tendency to automatically devalue proposals that come from antagonists. So if we got something from Russia, we would automatically think that, discount it without thinking critically about it. It might be a good idea, but we wouldn't know because it came from Russia. So there are 188 of these cognitive biases listed on Wikipedia. That's a whole lot to try to master. But fortunately, there's a guy by the name of Buster Benson who grouped them by the problems our brains are trying to solve with them. First of all, in these complex systems, there's a lot going on. The truth is that we are processing thousands of bits per minute as we're looking out into the world, we're hearing the world, we're feeling, we're processing an enormous amount of information. The second problem is getting signal out of that noise. And so getting meaning, because we can't act if we don't have meaning. And so we have to have these shortcuts that make it so that we can make quick decisions that most of the time are right, but aren't right all the time. And the last one is there's so much out there, and we've got a limited tool here. We need to be careful about what we're trying to remember. We need to try to remember the most important bits. All right, on to the adventures. I'd like to take a look at one of the most famous adventures done by our heroes, John Hanning Speke and Richard Burton. It was an expedition to find the source of the Nile. Here are our intrepid heroes. John Hanning Speke is on the left. Richard Burton is on the right. These two gentlemen had worked together before. They had a little history. Burton had asked Speke to join an earlier expedition to Somalia, which was an effort to open up some commercial opportunities in the region for the East India Company, who was the employer for both these guys. Speke was a last-minute addition. Speke had been trying to go into Somalia on his own, and the person he was saying, well, maybe you should join Burton. And so I went to talk to Burton, and Burton brought him along. That project ended like this. That is John Hanning Speke running away from his Somali captors. The Somalis attacked the expedition in retaliation for Burton's decision to arrest a tribal official who Speke accused of being difficult. In his words, the man was exhibiting obstreperous behavior. In the midst of the battle, in a classic instance of mid-Victorian English team building, Burton screamed at Speke that he was a coward. Speke was fighting from within his tent, which was probably tactically prudent. Speke, as it turns out, had more experience in warfare than Burton did. By the end of it, one man in their expedition was killed, and both Burton and Speke were seriously wounded. Burton got a spear through his face, piercing one cheek and going through the other and knocking out a couple of molars. And he had to run away with the spear clenched in his mouth. And Speke was captured, tied to a tree. He was stabbed multiple times in the limbs until he was able to escape. The East India Company initiated a 2-year investigation into the incident to determine if Burton had been negligent in setting up the defenses of the camp. In the meantime, Burton published a memoir of the expedition in which he gave a fairly unfavorable account of Speke's performance. The complexity of the relationship between the two men, keep in mind they are now on a new expedition together. The complexity of that relationship has gotten a lot of attention from historians and biographers. But I'm going to tell you tonight that that complexity pales. It's but a footnote compared to the complexity of the world that they stepped into. And so I'm going to start at a very high level here, just to give you a sense for how these systems work. And so these are the tectonic plates around Africa. The area they were going into is right in here, around Lake Victoria. And what happens when tectonic plates tear apart, and that's what's happening in the African plate, is you've got the Nubian side and you've got the Somalian side, and they are tearing apart at about 6 millimeters per year. What happens is you get very rugged landscape, including mountains and escarpments and plateaus and valleys and rivers and lakes. It looks like this. So our intrepid explorers expected to move a large caravan of people, scientific equipment, food, weapons, and a collapsible boat through this terrain. On top of that terrain, there was a human terrain that was also quite complex. By the time Burton and Speke arrived on the scene, there was a patchwork of more than 120 tribes, each with their own fiefdom, customs, culture, and language, bound together in a complex web of alliances, animosities, trading agreements, extra-tribal marriages, and the trading of slaves. To make it even more interesting, the region also had a long history of external human influences. This is a map of the regular caravans used by the Arab traders. And this was the route that was taken by Burton and Speke's from Bagamoyo through Tabora to Ujiji here by Lake Tanganyika. At one point, Speke goes up and finds Lake Victoria up here. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So there are the Arabs that were going through here, but the Arabs weren't the first in East Africa. Before the Arabs were the Portuguese, and before the Portuguese were the Greeks and Romans and West Indians. Well-armed caravans, sometimes including as many as 1,000 men, women, and children, raided villages throughout the region to take captives, to steal food, to punish non-compliant chiefs. People were killed and enslaved, and their homes were burned. And so this is the kind of world they're stepping into. It completely altered the politics, economy, and social structures. Farmers were producing food for caravans. Local chiefs, wherever possible, collected tolls. You might think that all this would have made life easier for the adventurers. I mean, after all, the Arabs were already running through here often, but they weren't Arabs. And so they weren't trusted by the locals. So there was also the animal life. There were hippos and crocodiles and hyenas and leopards and sorts of other creatures. And of course, mosquitoes and the dreaded tsetse fly, along with the parasites from malaria and sleeping sickness that they carry. Both men suffered horribly from malaria during the expedition, often having to be carried by the porters, and many of their donkeys died of sleeping sickness. So there was this complexity between the two players, Burton and Speke, but the world in which they entered was far more complex, and the thing that actually had the most impact on them was very small. It was the parasites. So who here has heard of the butterfly effect? Okay, so the idea is that it's a metaphor describing how the initial conditions in a complex system can have a huge impact on the outcome. Even things that initially seem trivial. The idea is that the beating wings of a butterfly in China can influence the weather in Brazil several weeks later. And here's how that butterfly effect played out for Burton and the East Africa project. Burton was in England when he got approval for the expedition. He'd been negotiating with the Royal Geographical Society and with the East India Company. And it was shortly after that that he got that he was going to be summoned as a witness for a court-martial of a friend of his. Now, he wasn't particularly excited about testifying against his friend, to be sure, but more importantly, he was worried that this case was going to drag on forever and he wasn't going to be able to go on the expedition. And he only had 2 years to do this. The East India Company had given him a leave of absence for 2 years. So he leaves England and immediately goes to Bombay, where he continues working for the East India Company and on the side preparing for the expedition. But the summons follows him to Bombay. And so he has to start the expedition. At that time, it's early December. And he shouldn't start the caravan in East Africa until July, August, or September. So he's already started the clock ticking. He and Speke spent about 5 months doing everything they can to prepare for the expedition. It gets to be June and they feel like they've got to start. The problem is that during the rainy season, all the porters go away, go back home, and don't come back until July. And so they had trouble finding people to carry all their stuff. And ultimately had to get themselves a large number of donkeys in order to fill in the gap. But even that was not enough. They had to leave an enormous amount of their stuff, including the collapsible boat, behind, and on the promise that somebody would find porters and bring that stuff with them. It took 11 months for that stuff to get to them. And the problem is that before they arrived, a third of their donkeys were killed with sleeping sickness and hyenas and leopards. This created a crisis in the expedition that almost brought it to an end. And if it hadn't been for luckily coming across 16 porters that had left the previous caravan and were convinced to join them, that would have been it. That would have been the end of the expedition. So in these complex systems, there are no do-overs. In a system that is merely complicated, like a computer, you can reset it. But you can't do that with a complex system. The technical term for this is path dependence. The state of the system depends on how you started and the choices you make along the way. If you're lost in the woods and you try to go down a trail that turns out to be a dead end, you can turn around and you can go back to where you started, but it's not the same system. You're hungrier, you're thirstier, you're tired, maybe it's dark. You no longer have the same set of choices available to you. But even though we don't have do-overs, we frequently try to do things over again, and so did Richard Burton. Richard Burton was a serial explorer. He kept trying again and again and again, and even though there were worthy accomplishments in each of these expeditions, he failed at some of the primary goals for all of these. Burton's pilgrimage to Mecca, which happened in 1853, actually was supposed to be an exploration of the entire western coast of the Arabian Peninsula and then down along the southern tip. The Somalia expedition, as we saw before, was supposed to open the region to commerce, but ended in warfare. During the East Africa expedition, John Hanning Speke does in fact find the source of the Nile, Lake Victoria, which he names, but isn't able to confirm that in fact any water flows out of it. He didn't see any water flow out of this lake. It just happened to be in the right place and about the right size, and so he assumed that was it. It took 2 more expeditions, led by Speke and Burton, Speke, not Burton, to prove that Lake Victoria was the source. So Burton, I believe, was entrepreneurial, and this is where I'm tying it back into the work that we do. Burton, I believe, was entrepreneurial, and I believe that entrepreneurs are explorers. Howard Stevenson, the godfather of entrepreneurship studies, has said that entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunities beyond the resources you currently control. Entrepreneurs must sell their idea to get the resources that they need. They network, discuss, revise, pitch, revise again, pull together the resources for a prototype. If the prototype goes well, they get more resources. Entrepreneurship is a willingness to envision something beyond the bounds of our current constraints. All that's required is that you aspire towards something new, something better, something necessitating resources beyond yourself, and to convince others to join you in that effort. Given this definition, Richard Burton was clearly had an entrepreneurial spirit. Burton had to pitch each of his projects, first to the Royal Geographical Society to get funding, to the East India Company to get the time off to do it. Both organizations, of course, needed to be convinced that there would be a return on their investment. Stevenson went on to develop an entrepreneurial model that I have formatted here in the same way that we have the Agile Manifesto. Entrepreneurs prefer quick but limited commitments over long-term commitment and big upfront planning. Entrepreneurs prefer multiple stages with minimal exposure at each stage. Episodic use of required resources. You bring them in as you need them. Flat organizational structures with multiple informal networks rather than formalized hierarchies. Value-based and team-based compensation rather than structured promotion ladders. In case you haven't seen it, this is the Agile Manifesto, and I think that there are similar ideas here, that in order to be an entrepreneur, you have to be agile. And it doesn't have to be business opportunities. It could be team process improvements or corporate initiatives. We can, each one of us, be agile. The question is, if there's a potential for entrepreneurial endeavors all around us, why don't more of us operate that way? There have been, in fact, many efforts on the part of corporations to make their culture more entrepreneurial with limited success. Now, I think that the reason why people have trouble doing it is because of the risk. 90% of startups fail. 70% of organizational change initiatives fail. So why do we do it? I mean, with all this failure going on, why do we keep trying these things? So there's a guy by the name of Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist famous for his work on the psychology of judgment and decision-making, and the author of the book Thinking Fast and Slow. He has said that we humans are prone to an astounding level of optimistic overconfidence. We regularly minimize the costs, the schedule, and the risks of our endeavors. In addition, we overestimate our abilities and have more confidence in our ability to forecast outcomes than any reasonable assessment of our track record would warrant. Kahneman believes that this optimism bias may well be the most significant of the many, many, many cognitive biases out there. In fact, he says that it is the engine of capitalism. But it isn't simply the fact that so many of us are affected by this bias that makes it so significant. It's that the folks among us who have the largest impact on our collective lives, the inventors, the politicians, the military leaders, the entrepreneurs, have such a disproportionately large dose of this optimism. They are the challenge seekers and the risk takers. Their extreme optimism means that their judgments and decisions are by definition hopelessly flawed. And so they fail. They fail a lot. But when fortune smiles on them, they win big. And so we as a society celebrate their overreaching optimism, so much so that Kahneman says we reward the providers of dangerously misleading information more than we reward truth tellers. So would someone please insert some reality into these bozos? It's easy to say, that seems reasonable, but in fact, we devote a lot of lip service to seeing things as they really are. We talk about estimating better. We try to get better at vetting people and projects. But just try to be a naysayer in the face of somebody's delusional optimism. Want to lose friends and alienate people? Go around bursting their optimistic bubbles. Not only is there considerable risk that you'll find yourself suddenly an outsider, you will likely be unsuccessful in changing their plans. Even if all parties can be convinced that you're right, they will very likely proceed with their plans regardless, because of what Kahneman has called irrational perseverance. But before you go out there trying to convince people to be more sane, consider this. What great moments in human history would we not have without this delusional optimism? Would we have landed on the moon? What about the American Revolution? Or the 20th century overthrow of colonial rule around the world? Or the Arab Spring? And advances in science, antibiotics, polio vaccine, mapping the human genome, the discovery of exoplanets, and all of the various entrepreneurial efforts. Imagine for a moment the original pitch for Twitter. Dude, it's like blogging, only micro-blogging. No, nano-blogging. We're going to limit it to 140 characters, and you're going to text them from your phone. Brilliant, right? There must have been some investor in the room, when they heard that, who was going, well, how do you make money with that? But they did. And so we celebrate these delusional dreamers. Many of them fail. Many of them fail over and over and over again, picking themselves up each time to try again. Each time persuaded by their delusions. And as they must be. Kahneman says that anyone who lacks a delusional faith in themselves and their endeavors would wilt in the face of repeated experiences of multiple small failures and rare successes. Well, Richard Burton, a man who was as delusional as they come, didn't wilt. So, from a systemic perspective, what I want to share is you can think of entrepreneurs as people who are seeking peaks in a fog-encased landscape. You're trying to climb to a better place, but you're having to make guesses about where that might be. To make matters worse, the landscape is constantly shifting underneath you. In fact, it feels like it's actively dancing. One day you might be standing on the peak, and the next day that peak becomes a valley. So yes, you might fail by delusionally scrambling around to find higher peaks, but you can also fail by standing still. If you stand back and look at the whole system of entrepreneurs, each of them is scrambling to find a peak. Despite the large number of failures, as a society, we tend to move up. We learn from our failures, turning them into successful experiment, adaptation. And when one wins big, many of us get to ride the coattails. So we go up and up until there's a cataclysmic change that knocks us all down again. From the individual perspective, we want to make the best bets we can. But there's this tension between optimism and skepticism that's not easily resolved. You actually need both. You need the skepticism to keep you from doing something really stupid, but you need the optimism to keep you moving on a dancing landscape. Okay, so here are the practices. First, I want to talk about stand-ups. The important thing about stand-ups is that they are about course corrections. They are not status reporting. If you are not getting course corrections regularly in your stand-ups, then you need to ask why. The next thing is be careful about your rituals. The small interactions that you do on a regular basis, they add up. They become, they have broad impacts. A good example is pair programming. Pair programming is a simple practice, but has many, many, many impacts on the team. Everything from reducing defects, having better quality, reducing staffing risks, and so on. What about accountability? The problem with accountability, I think, is that we assume that accountability is the same in all places, but it's not. There's the accountability we have for the team. There's the accountability we have for leaders. And there's the accountability for wrongdoing. These are different. We need to think about them differently. So there are a number of blog posts on the site that I mentioned that talk about some of these practices. One of them is something called the devising game. I'll let you look at the blog post to get the details. It's primarily about working collaboratively to improve the quality of our solutions, taking into account groupthink. There's a post on complexity-informed pre-mortems, which is an effort to see more clearly the risks that we face. And the last one is taking time to not think. In our creative processes, sometimes there are moments that we get insights, that are not part of our deliberative practice. Right? That's the main model. There are the Gonzalez rules. The thing about this is that they are primarily negative. He also has another set of qualities that are for true survivors, those who are in difficult situations. And the one I want to really call out here is the one about true survivors are rescuers and not victims. The idea is that the people who really survive in difficult situations often don't do it for themselves, they do it for others. And so it's important, I think, to figure out who you're doing it for. And that's the thought I'll leave you with. Thank you.